Okay, good evening. I think we can start now. Welcome, everyone. I am Helen Melko, Associate Director for ACOR. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our second lecture this spring. Before we start our webinar, I would like to share with you a few announcements. If you're new to ACOR's lectures, welcome and thank you for joining us. You can learn more about ACOR by going to our website. I encourage you to subscribe to receive announcements and news on our projects and programs in Jordan and beyond. I'm very happy to share with you that our library is now open by appointment. Please write to the email appearing on your screen for further information. This spring, we have an exciting lecture series. Make sure to register for our next talk with Professor Nada Shabot and her talk, History Disjointed, Mapping Art Histories in the Arab World, Iran, and Turkey. Today, I'm happy to welcome our speaker, Jennifer Ramsay, a current board member of ACOR and a former fellow. Jennifer is Associate Professor and Chair of Anthropology Department at SUNY Brookport. She received a PhD in archaeology from Simon Fraser University. Her area of expertise centers on the use of archaeobotany, subsistence reconstruction, trade patterns, environmental change, and land use patterns to gain insight into life ways of past societies. Although she specializes in the Roman and late antique world, Jennifer has also analyzed and published plant material from the Neolithic, Bronze, and Iron Ages and Islamic periods. Over her career, she has participated in many archaeological excavations in Jordan, Israel, and Italy. Jennifer received the Archaeological Institute of America Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching Award in 2019 and 2 State University of New York SUNY Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2014 and Excellence in Faculty Services in 2020. Amazing indeed, and congrats, Jennifer. Before I hand it over to Jennifer, I would like to remind you to please send your questions through the Q&A button at any time during the talk. We will address as many questions as possible by the end of the presentation. Also, please note that this lecture, I should have switched, is recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel where you can view it later, and you can also view our past lectures. With that, I hand it over to you, Jennifer. Thank you. Stop sharing. Over to you.
Okay, all right. Great. Okay, I think that works. All right, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to wherever you are joining us from today. Thank you very much for coming. And I'd like to first start off by thanking ACOR, Helen, Pierce Paul, and Duna for the invitation and the honor to share some of my research today. I'd also like to note that if it wasn't for ACOR and a KORC fellowship that I was lucky enough to be awarded in 2007, I would not be doing the research that I'm doing today. It allowed me to finish my dissertation when I had 2 young children at home, which was very challenging at the time. So now one is in college and one I'm looking towards getting into college soon. So like many of you know that are listening today, I'm sure you agree that ACOR is a very special place. So today I would like to talk about the work I have been doing with respect to examining and interpreting plant remains recovered from sediment samples from some of the shaft tombs in the North Ridge of Petra. Before I begin, I wanted to note that the Petra North Ridge project, which is what this study is part of, was directed by Professors Megan Perry and the late Professor Tom Parker, who many of you know and who is a very long time board member at ACOR and of course was an archaeologist in Jordan for many, many years. He's dearly missed by many of us, and as I know at the end of this talk, he would have had some amazing questions for me. So he is truly missed today. And Megan, of course, directs the excavations of the tombs and has published extensively on the bioarchaeological remains from them. And she's also worked with me on this material. So thank you, Megan. So plant remains, I know it's exciting, huh? Everybody eats plants, but how much do we think about them in the archaeological record? Not that much. It's getting much better. But anyway, plant remains are rarely documented from funerary contexts. And I wish to help address this lack of information through the analysis of several archaeobotanical samples recovered from the Northridge tombs in Petra. And I hope to gain a better understanding of the role that plants actually played in this type of ritual context. So I'd like to begin today with a brief introduction to the site and an overview of the tombs, followed by briefly what we have in terms of comparative funerary data of both sites, contexts, and of course plant remains, and then look at the archaeobotanical methods used, my results, a little bit about the significance of what I found, and then of course finally some conclusions. So let me start off with a quick overview of Petra for those that might not have had the wonderful joy of actually being there. Petra was the capital of the ancient Nabatean kingdom, and what remains of this once thriving city is located along the eastern slope of the Ashara mountain range. It's approximately 80 kilometers southeast of the Dead Sea, so you can see on the map here. So the site is really situated in a wide basin that's surrounded by deeply eroded mountainous ridges of sandstone and limestone that kind of form a natural fortification for the site. The presence of several natural springs and the Nabateans, who were incredibly, had great ingenuity in terms of hydraulic engineering skills, provided abundant water for the area because this region really only gets between about 100 and 200 millimeters of annual precipitation. So it is quite arid. So the site itself, or the Nabateans, sorry, at Petra, were people that lived in this southern Levant, which is this eastern Mediterranean area, and into northern Arabia. Their origins and identity are debated, but we know they emerged as a distinct political entity at some point between the 4th and the 2nd centuries BCE. And the development of Petra as an important political, economic, and cultural center during the 2nd century BCE through the 2nd century CE, so about a 400-year period, was really the result of their strategic position on the crossroads of major trade and communication routes that cut through the region between Egypt, Arabia, and the Mediterranean region and into Mesopotamia. So today, Petra is famous for its rock-cut tomb facades and hydraulic engineering. And it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I'm sure many of you have seen images of these tombs in movies, like of course, Indiana Jones and Transformers and several other ones that the tomb facades have been in. So these tomb structures that immortalized the Nabatean dead captured the gaze of tourists visiting the ancient Nabatean capital city of Petra. The Nabateans at Petra clearly utilized mortuary contexts as a form of display during the 1st centuries BCE through the 1st century CE, so for at least a 200-year period. This vivid mortuary landscape surrounding the city center probably had a similar effect on the visual experience of Petra's ancient residents, even more so considering their engagement with the historical memory of the individuals that were housed inside these tombs. However, for years, these rock-carved tombs were not considered beyond their elaborate facades and a nominal understanding of the architectural features within for receiving the dead. Recent tomb excavations at Petra, like the Petra Northridge project, focuses on recovering the material remains of mortuary ritual and the deceased themselves, and has provided a deeper and more detailed understanding of the behaviors surrounding the Nabatean treatment of the dead. So the research area of the Northridge project extends eastward from the highest point west of the Ridge Church, which is just about up here, let's see, up here on the map, I have a few maps here. Thank you, Megan. And to where the northern inner wall corners towards the Wadi Mataha, and it's focused on really exploring the city's northern neighborhoods. In addition to the northern city wall that's built on the ridge, and it was built in the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, and you can kind of see it detailed here and over here as well. The tomb excavation component of the Petra North Ridge project began in 1998 when 2 shaft tombs were encountered during clearing of the Ridge Church by the American Center of Research, and they were excavated by Drs. Patricia Bakay and by Dr. Megan Perry. And these shaft chamber tombs carved vertically into the bedrock, they lack the grandeur and the ornamentation of the large facade tombs, but the artifacts they contain highlight the importance of mortuary ritual, including feastings and offerings. The excavation of these tombs dating to the Nabatean period really aimed to learn more about the lives of ordinary people in the city through the recovery of bioarchaeological evidence and artifacts. In 2012, 2014, and 2016, excavations of the Petra North Ridge, co-directed by Megan Perry and the late Tom Parker, focused on 8 tombs, 6 in Area B and 2 in Area F. And they recovered numerous articulated, commingled skeletal remains, along with intentional and accidental mortuary artifacts. So 5 of the 8 tombs that we have were used for burials, and they contained articulated, commingled human skeletal remains, along with materials associated with individuals interred, like jewelry and other objects, perhaps involved in mortuary ritual, such as lamps. Here's an example of a Nabatean oil lamp. Thank you very much, Sarah Wenner, for the analysis and the images. And unguentaria, again, thank you, Sarah, for that image. And the unguentaria likely contained perfume oils, which Petra was actually quite famous for. Megan noted that the bedrock surrounding these vertical tomb shafts has been leveled, which you can kind of see here during a little meeting and discussion at the top of the tomb. And this could have been for feasting around the tomb. Supporting this hypothesis is the inclusion of numerous ceramic plates and bowls and cups, in addition to the remains of animal and plants that may have been involved in mortuary commemoration through feastings or offerings to the deceased. And just to give you a brief overview of the tombs, as Megan has, as I noted, published on the material previously, these tombs were accessed vertically through the bedrock by the shaft. So you can see kind of an example here of what this would have looked like from the surface. It's about 2.5 meters by 1 meter wide, and it goes down about 2.9 meters on average. And these shafts open up into rectangular chambers below, which you can see people in here in the image on the top. And they ranged in size, at least the ones that were excavated by the team, from about 7.3 meters squared to about 40 meters squared. And they averaged about 1.5 meters high, regardless of the surface area of the actual tomb. So 3 of the tombs explored, B8, B9, and F2, really remained unfinished and were never used for human burials. The other 5 tombs, B4, B5, B6, B7, and F1, contained varied features for interment of the corpses, such as rectangular niches, which you can see pictured here, rectangular shafts cut into the floor, and troughs and basins cut into the sides of the chambers or into the floor. And that's Jessica Walker there on the lower right, giving us an example of one of these. So analysis by Megan Perry and Jessica Walker of the 5 tombs with interments show that they were used for the burial of approximately 121 individuals from the late 2nd through the 1st centuries BCE, until around the end of the 1st century or beginning of the 2nd century CE. And this is based on ceramic or pottery evidence. Again, thank you, Sarah, for the pottery. So even though 3 of these tombs, B4, B6, and B7, had clearly been looted in antiquity, and B6 actually in the modern era as well, they provide rich artifactual and skeletal data that greatly expands the known range of Nabatean burial complexity. As for tombs B8, B9, and F2 that were carved, but they were actually left unfinished, tombs B8 and F2 consisted of fully formed chambers, with B8 containing 2 unfinished rectangular floor shaft graves, and F2 having mason's marks of kind of on the floor of the tomb. Likely this would have been a work in progress that clearly didn't continue. So tomb B9 provides some insight into the construction of chamber tombs. The tomb's chamber was linked to that of tomb B7. So you can see in the middle image here, we have B9 and B7 were actually linked via a small window and a doorway. However, B9's chamber floor was almost a ½ meter higher than that of B7. And the existing floor of B9 was crossed with channels, which was interesting. And it was measuring 10 to 15 centimeters wide and about 25 centimeters deep. So these were pretty significant channels. And these channels probably represented the remains of what was called a trench and wedge quarrying technique noted in other parts of Petra and at the site of Medellin and Sala, which I'll talk about after. So several tombs have actually been excavated in Petra besides those on the North Ridge, like Stefan Schmidt's excavations in Wadi Farasa of the Renaissance tomb and the soldier tomb, Fauzi Zayadin's excavations at tomb 813, and David Johnson's excavations at Wadi Mataha. And even the Horsfelds, quite some time ago, excavations of the Triple Dushara tomb. But as far as I know, and I've looked into it a lot, no plant remains have actually been analyzed, although there was mention that some samples had been taken. So I'm hoping that some of these will be analyzed in the future for comparison. There also was some interesting residue analysis that was carried out at some of the shaft tombs they have libation holes at the top of the tomb. And some of these they looked at the residue analysis in these and they found there was animal fats and some plant residue in these, which was quite interesting. They couldn't, of course, get it down to what species or type of plant it was, but it looks like it was a resinous plant. So that's kind of interesting as well. So there are some kind of cool things going on with analysis in the tombs. Okay, so before we actually look at the plants themselves, I know, which I really should be doing, let's look for ways to try to better understand the Nabatean funerary context. And to do this, we kind of look at similar sites to Petra. So clearly the site of Medellin and Sala, which I highlighted here, ancient Hegra, located in northwestern Saudi Arabia, is the best example available. Medellin and Sala has been excavated recently by a Saudi-French project led by Leila Nemi and Daifala Al-Tali. And the excavators note that the site was most densely inhabited in the Nabatean period, during which the town was at the southernmost limits of the Nabatean kingdom on the route between Petra and Arabia Felix, further to the south. Just like Petra, monumental tombs with decorated facades were carved into the sandstone cliffs. Although many tombs have been documented, only sparse carbonized plant materials have been recorded, and they are from the facade tombs and not the shaft tombs, which I'll discuss shortly. Mortuary practices and grave offerings have been documented during excavations of cemeteries at Memphis and Khazrawet. These are Nabatean period sites in the Negev and in the northern Sinai region. And they were occupied in the 2nd century CE, but no botanical material was recovered from these. But jewelry with interesting botanical themes, I'll take it where I can get it here, has been found at the site. So we have these earrings with clusters of grapes around them. We have this nose ring that has kind of this pomegranate as well as kind of botanical themes on it. And this nose ring is very similar to one that was found in the Northridge project in one of the shaft tombs. And there's also comparative funerary material that was excavated by Fawzi Zayedin from burials at the Nabatean hypogeum of Det Ras. And during a slightly later dated site of Wadi Mudaifat and Wadi al-Kasherif that was excavated by Zayed al-Salamin and Hani Falahat. But no plant remains were recovered from these, although there was an incredibly impressive array of nicely preserved organic remains. There was textiles and leather and bone and hair that were documented from this site as well, but no plants, unfortunately. So we can look to the larger region and surrounding cultures that may have had an influence on the Nabateans and their burial customs. For example, according to Lucy Alder Miller, feasting is thought to have been part of the funerary rite observed in Palmyrene tombs in what is Syria today. And finds of incense burners and offering bowls suggested that the living offered nourishment to the deceased relatives, which really created this form of commensality through which the living actually interacted with the dead. In Egypt, the pyramid and coffin texts note that the deceased wants to eat, drink, and live on what the gods ate, drank, and lived on. And according to the text, what these gods ate, drank, and lived on was bread, beer, wine, various cuts of meat, grapes, and figs. So the food presented at the ritual offering was therefore food for the gods. By eating and drinking in this kind of celestial realm with the gods, the deceased really became part of the community, while the ritual provisioning of the meal at a tomb in the world kind of maintained this living and dead community together. So they were important feasts. Also, for example, although much earlier, this rectangular stone stele on the far right here honors an official named Mentuozer, and he's clasping a folded piece of linen in his hand. He sits at his funeral banquets, ensuring that he will always receive a food offering and that his family will honor and remember him forever. To the right of Mentuozer, his son summons his spirit, his daughter holds a lotus, and his father is offered a covered dish of food and a jug that, given its shape, looks like it contains beer. In the Hellenistic funerary iconography of the Greek East and of Asia Minor, there are many illustrations of what the so-called totemal. And on the lower left, which you can see in this image over here, this was a very popular theme of these kind of commemorative plaques here in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. And we really see the appearance of this totema in artistic representations in the context of Western Anatolia, which is modern Turkey, in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. So earlier, but maybe at the beginnings of when the Nabateans start to appear. Also from an earlier period, the Nabateans, an earlier period than the Nabateans, we see funerary feasts in kind of the Persian world, which they think maybe was the origins of this totema, and that funerary dining in these triclinia, in these banqueting rooms, is associated with these tomb structures that then carries through to Roman times and that we find throughout Petra. So these examples really help us gain a better understanding of funerary rituals that likely had an influence, at least, on the Nabateans in some way. And then we have, and then we can see correlations with respect to the Marzeha and the Nabatean funerary dining. So the Marzeha were very common in the ancient Levant. And these were eating and drinking festivals. These were essential elements of a banquet, was this drinking and eating, so banqueting, feasting. So regarding the rites and rituals that were practiced in these Marzeha, they were either funerary rites, which were aimed at commemorating the dead, or they were rituals associated with living persons. And the Marzeha is the only Nabatean banquet known from inscriptions and has been documented several times. Isabel Sachet provides a very informative overview of the banqueting rooms or triclinia around Petra that would have been used for these marzeha, and they vary in size and scale from ones that could hold, say, 10 guests to ones for the very, very wealthy that could hold significantly more people. These are examples here. I threw in this Movenpick example because I'm like, in modern times, we still have banqueting and feasting. So this is an example from the Movenpick Hotel where they said here you can have your wedding banquet outside these tombs. So I thought that that was quite interesting. We all still have, you know, these feasts and these festivals, and we still celebrate these types of things. And these, of course, these are at Little Petra or Beta. Some of the tombs with triclinia and dining areas there as well, just outside of Petra. Well, as noted above, there's a good deal of evidence for ancient literary sources, works of art, and archaeological remains for the practice of funerary dinings and offerings to the dead, such as the images that we have just seen. Also the pottery, and the faunal remains, which are animal bones that are left over from feasting. But there's surprisingly little in the way of plant remains that have been recovered from mortuary contexts in Petra. A likely reason for this is that these offerings were probably perishable, so they didn't last very long. And if they had been just left in the tomb, then they wouldn't have preserved, so we wouldn't have had evidence of them archaeologically. They would have had to been burnt, which is carbonized, so that preserves quite nicely, or dried out, like we see in Medellin and Sala, so desiccated for them to kind of preserve. There is, however, excellent preservation of desiccated, so dried out material from Medellin and Sala, which I alluded to earlier. So during the excavations there, at tomb IGN 120, Caroline Bouchaud recovered several wonderful desiccated specimens of a number of fruit and nut species like melon and walnut and pomegranate, and even imported peach, likely imported peach. And excavations of one of the other tombs, IGN 117, produced a large array of bones, as well as leather and fabric and fruit and wood of the Nabatean Roman period. Although only a sparse assemblage of carbonized plants were noted, they did consist mostly of cereals like wheat and barley, as well as dates and figs and a few weed species that have been documented to date. There was also an amazing find of wooden coffins from these tombs, textiles and leather, and a date necklace was recovered from one of the interments. And I find it quite interesting because when I was working in Petra before, Halid, one of the women at the house, she gave me this beautiful clove necklace that is an entire necklace that's hard to see with my zoom, but it's made out of cloves, and it really reminded me of this date necklace, and it still smells amazing after many years. So I can smell it right now. It's great. So a little farther afield at the classical and the Hellenistic necropolis of Limenas in Greece, a little farther, but still the influence of that Greco-Roman influence on Petra makes it significant. There was carbonized food that was found that's burnt in cooking pots that are found near pyres. And it appears that they had pomegranate and garlic, grape and bread, and these were all dedicated to the dead there. In North Africa, there was plant evidence that has been noted at a number of cemetery sites, especially at Thina, at Susa, at Rakata, at Leptis Magna, and especially from Leptiminus. And these include olive and fig and grape and wheat. So we kind of have a common theme here of food. And these are interpreted either as offerings in the tombs or, in the case of cremations, burnt at the time of the funeral, and then included in the cremated remains, or else they are food offerings that were left at the grave at a later date. And then there was this wonderful synthesis of archaeobotanical data that examined the symbolism of plants recovered from 32 Gallo-Roman funerary sites that were found And they identified many remains from the site from urns and cremation pyres, so also kind of cremated debris. And to the east, funerary evidence from the excavations of Ur, although significantly earlier in date by a couple thousand years, they found some amazing evidence of food debris, burnt food debris. That demonstrates that kind of food offerings to the deceased in funerary context has a long history in the Near East. And the charred remains from Ur included chickpea and barley and wheat and peas and dates and crabapple and bread. And the authors are really uncertain about how the remains became carbonized, but they note that they may have been burnt for some symbolic reason. And there was a wide array of diversity of species, but it was also noted that the methodology for all of these different places, of course, varied greatly, and the quantity of material was often very sparse. So specifically, the simple funerary image of a deceased or living seated at a table laden with food and drink is actually very complex, and there's multiple layers of meaning in it. Examples like the ones I just mentioned aid us really in gaining a better understanding of the complex funerary rituals practiced in the region, which likely influenced Nabatean funerary rituals. So after all that, let's get into my plants. So what do we have in the plant remains from the North Ridge? So the recovery of the carbonized botanical remains from well-stratified sediment samples taken from the tombs was carried out in the field using the flotation technique, which my former student Danielle Meerlander is giving a good example of right here. And this method really consists of pouring sediment, which is literally bags of dirt, which she also is looking at up here and making sure we've cataloged and documented. So pouring dirt into a liquid media, which is basically water for our case, but it doesn't always have to be. I've used hydrogen peroxide and lots of other fun things, but water works well for us. And the surface tension of this liquid of water, together with the lower specific gravity of the carbonized material, combined to keep the carbonized material floating at or just below the surface of the water, while all the inorganic material would like sink to the bottom of the bucket and then be collected in a mesh screen, which is what she's kind of laying out here to dry, which we sort through in the field and find all sorts of fun things in there. So the resulting material that floats on the surface is then poured off through sieves, which are kind of right here, lovely sieves, which are 1 millimeter and 250 microns in size. And this material is then dried, which is why she's hanging up little paper towel, which look like socks on a clothesline on the roof in Sayun. So we dry out this material, package it up, and it gets transported back to my lab here at State University of New York, Brockport. And the heavy fractions are all sorted in the field. So the flotation samples are then taken into the lab, which you can kind of see in the top here, and they're identified, and we pull up to 40 times magnification is used, and the carbonized seeds, grains, fruit, and all other material that is really identified as a plant fragment is removed for identification. And we identify these by using my modern comparative collection in the lab, as well as my years of knowledge of looking at these comparative seed atlases. And when in doubt, you get that one phone call. You reach out to your colleagues and get some help in consulting on plant species. Exciting, I know. Anyway, so what did we find in all this dirt, or what were the results? So I identified 1,167 carbonized seeds, chaff. Chaff is like the byproducts of crop processing. It's the little bits that hold a grain onto the stalk. I know it's not thrilling, but it's very cool when you're an archaeobotanist. So we had seeds and chaff and fruit and nut fragments. And these were from 113 samples that comprised just over 275 liters of sediment that was recovered from the 8 tombs. From all samples analyzed, there were a total of 24 different taxa or unique kind of specimen species that were identified. And these were from 2 cereals that you can see on the list here. We had barley and bread wheat. We had only 1 legume, but I'll talk more about why that might be later, but lentil, again, not too surprising. We had 4 fruit and nut, olive, grape, fig, and date, and about 17 different weed or wild species, but they were really only found in very sparse quantities. And a lot of them are from kind of agricultural fields, kind of the leftovers from those. And there was also some what's called parenchymatous tissue, which is basically the charred remains of the actual fruit. So if you had a fig, I have a beautiful example of a fig parenchymatous tissue, which is the fruit of the fig that's been charred. So we have some of those, and we also have eggshell in the sample, which I find quite interesting, and we'll mention again in a moment. So analysis of the number and category of plant remains recovered was carried out for each tomb. And 3 of the tombs, B4, B8, and F1, as you can see pictured here, had very sparse results, unfortunately, which made it difficult to really include them in the analysis and interpretation of these kind of botanical remains from the tomb. So the other 5 remaining tombs, 3, B5, B6, and B7, which I'll talk more about in a second, had interments. So these had skeletal remains in them, and 2, B9, and F2 did not. So tomb B5 only had 57 remains, which is what I just highlighted there, which included cereal grains, some chaff, some lentils, figs, olives, grapes, and 6 weed seeds. I know it's not a lot, but anyway, that's what we had. So, and then we can see the analysis of these 2 tombs, and these 2 were pretty important in terms of the number of the number of remains that were found, as well as the context that they were recovered from. So this is the analysis of tombs B6 and B7, and they had the most species recovered from the context. So the blue column that you see represents material recovered from settlement around articulated remains. And articulated remains is when you're buried without, you have not been moved. It's like your primary burial. All your bones are still in place, for those that don't know what that is. But anyway, so that's the sediment around those remains. And the orange columns represent material that was from disturbed or commingled remains, which means it's like a secondary burial, or the bones have been moved since the person had been buried. Or it was material on the floor of the tomb. And the gray columns are material from naturally deposited fill samples. So you can see there was not very much in those. So in both tombs, the majority of the charred plant material was found in sediments that were recovered around articulated remains. Significantly fewer remains were recovered from sediment from the disturbed or commingled remains, except for 1 little lentil sample, but that's kind of an exception, and there was only a small number of those. And even fewer are from these natural sediment fills. So the significance of this I will discuss in just a moment. And the 2 tombs that were examined that didn't have any interments, so there was no skeletal remains in these tombs, we looked at chronologically and by plant category for trends and kind of for control, basically, because we couldn't compare these to the remains that were from articulated bodies and commingled bodies. So samples from B9 were recovered from sediment that was dated through ceramic analysis to the late 1st, early 2nd centuries CE at the latest, and this really helps support when these tombs were actually in use. And these clearly show a high proportion of cereals, as well as the usuals, like a few. There wasn't a lot of them, but there was also some olive, grape, date, and fig. And there was no eggshell in either of these. And the samples from F2 date to either the early Roman period in blue or the late Roman period in orange. And as you can see, the vast majority of the botanical remains identified date to the early Roman period, again supporting the period of use of these tombs. So what does all the analysis of these plant remains tell us, or what is its significance? Why do I care? So after examining the botanical data in conjunction with other artifactual and textual evidence, it appears that the plant material identified from the tombs on the North Ridge provide evidence of some form of funerary ritual involving food plants being provided to the dead as offerings, rather than the remains of funerary dining events for the living or accidental deposition. That does not mean that there was no funerary dining. That just means that what was found in the tomb was different than what would have probably been part of the funerary dining event. So support for this conclusion is that the botanical material recovered from the tombs B6 and B7 show that the majority of the charred plants were recovered from sediments surrounding sealed articulated burials and not commingled or fill sediment. So the plants found to be most common in these contexts, as I've said several times, are these wheats and lentils and grapes and figs and olives and dates, all of which have been documented in texts and at comparative sites noted to be components of funerary offerings or meals, also part of the diet. So interestingly, the high number of chaff fragments, which again are those little boring things that attach the grain to the stalk, point towards maybe the whole cereal, because there was in this top corner here, that's part of a stalk of grain. And this is part of this chaff fragment here, this image. Maybe they were offering full kind of heads of grain, of cereal grain, like a barley or wheat in the tomb as an offering, which I think is kind of interesting. And also there was the little peduncle of grape. So unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the little peduncle, but you know those little stems that hold the grape onto the stalk. So there was several of those that were found that were charred. And that's interesting too, because it may have meant that they were also had offerings of bunches of grapes, like as an offering. Likewise, the recovery of several lentils suggests that they could have been included as an offering in the assemblage and not part of a funerary feast, as generally when legumes are cooked, like lentils or beans or peas, for consumption, they don't preserve that well. Think of hummus. You're going to be eating a lot of it, but try charring that. It's not going to work so well. So when you just have the lentil that hasn't been cooked, and it's just it may have just been an offering. Also recovered from tomb B6 and B7 in burial contexts were eggshells, which I always think are fun to find. And this is an example of an eggshell down here. And this is an example here of the parenchymatous tissue, which is just kind of the flesh of the fruit. And we have wheat and barley and an olive and weed seeds here, Lolium, Graminaceae, Galium. Anyway, I get distracted by plants. I know, crazy. So these eggshells are quite interesting, and they had been noted to be components of funerary offerings elsewhere. And in the Roman period, eggshells were seen as a symbol of fertility and immortality. And there is evidence that they were burnt together with plant remains as foundational offerings at a site in France where they were found in the Roman period. So the identification of this parenchymatous tissue, again, this kind of fleshy bits here of fruit or vegetable, could be remains of something like a fig or bread, but we have not examined these closely enough, and these ones are actually quite small, so we're hoping to do that in the future. In further support of the botanical material recovered from the natural fill deposits in tomb B6 and B7 are very sparse in terms of the identified botanical remains, which lend support to the charred remains recovered near burials having been associated with burial contexts. So it's like, we have more here, so it's probably here for a reason and not something that had washed in later, especially because a lot of these, especially the articulated ones, are from sealed contexts. So weed and wild species have been recovered from both contexts, but was sparse. And it may indicate, at least because I'm a proponent of dung fuel, that dung fuel was being used to perhaps as for fires or to char the material before being offered to the deceased. Because dung fuel is obviously the remains of dung from animals. They eat a lot of these wild weed seeds, and that's how it gets incorporated into a lot of different carbonized assemblages. So the dating also of samples of samples from tombs F9 and B2 and the plant remains recovered from these provide support that the tombs in the area were functioning in this early Roman period. And the remains from tomb F2 provide clear evidence that the majority of the plant material was incorporated into the samples in the early Roman period, which also provides support for the tombs having been functioning during that time. So the types of plants that were identified from the North Ridge tombs are not surprising. They are species that we commonly have cultivated in the region in the Nabatean period and have been documented at several Nabatean sites, both banqueting and potential cultic sites, as well as from domestic contexts at El Zantur, which is the villa site in Petra, and the pool and garden complex in Petra as well. So we know these plants are growing locally. However, the context that they are found clearly points to a funerary function, and therefore it offers important information about the types of plants used in mortuary rituals in Petra. So in conclusion, the recovery of human remains as well as burial goods, including jewelry and oil lamps and perfume bottles, aid in a better understanding of the Nabatean funerary practices. And analysis of this charred archaeobotanical remains, these plant remains recovered from these sediment samples in the tombs, indicates that we have a wide variety of foodstuffs found in the tomb, like wheats and barley and lentil and grape and fig and dates. And these finds provide intriguing evidence of the potential plant materials used as offerings during the Nabatean period in Petra. So this study, in association with the analysis of bioarchaeological remains and ceramics and faunal remains, really expands our knowledge of how plants functioned in funerary rituals and really contributes to a broader understanding of ritual practices in the ancient world, as well as a little on support for local diet and environment with the weeds, but that's a whole nother story. So thank you very much. I would really like to acknowledge the support of ACOR, the American Center of Research. Thank you for having me speak today. The Department of Antiquities in Jordan for all of their support, and the Petra Archaeological Park. The funding for the project, a lot of it came from the National Endowment of the Humanities and the National Geographic Society. And a special thank you to the late Tom Parker, who co-directed the project, and he was always tremendously supportive and encouraging of this project. And thank you to my former students, Jeffrey Hedges, Danielle Marylander, Matthew Vineyard, Dennis Paoni, for their assistance with flotation in the field and in the lab. And a special gratitude is owed to the Badul of Sayhun, especially the family of Daklala Kublan, for their valued contributions to the project and their warm hospitality. So thank you all for coming virtually today, and I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Very interesting presentation. Thank you. Now we can entertain some questions. So, okay. So the first question is from Anne Reynolds, and it says, do you think the botanical remains in the unfinished tombs were the meals of workmen constructing them?
I think it's challenging to say because I think that they very well may have been, because I certainly have seen the remains of plant material all over Petra, just even when we're working on the site, from little fires and things. I also think that some of it may have very easily washed in from other areas. There may have been deposits of, a garbage dump nearby. The rains come and might have washed it all in, but it could have been. It's hard to tell. I would love to see more information from other tombs be analyzed, because we really only had those 2 tombs that had material in it. And it was from such a large time span that it wasn't kind of a discrete, we had 158 specimens in one area. It kind of was over a longer period of time. So I do think, you know, olive pits and grape pips are always fun because people spit those out all the time when they're having lunch. So, but they would have had to be, these ones were all carbonized, so they would have had to been burnt. So they must have spit them into the fire at some point. And then during tea time, because that's what you do, right?
You keep your fire on, right?
Exactly. You get those pits in there. We use those a lot, but great question. And I wish I had a solid definitive answer.
Okay, so
but it could be.
Wonderful. There is a question that is not related to plants, but it's still related. And I think kind of it's interesting to have both. So the question says, what types of animal bones were found? If you have a rough idea, because then, yeah, I think it's interesting.
Yes, I haven't read the most recent animal bone reports, but most of what we found in the past were a lot of sheep and goat, which isn't terribly surprising. Sheep, goat, and more sheep, goat. So I'm trying to remember exactly if for birds, I know because I did a whole thing on pigeon bones, but that's a whole nother story. But the majority of these assemblages are sheep and goat, although I would have to consult our archaeozoologist to see what else we have in there. I'm sorry, I wish I had reviewed all that. I know there was a few cool things like a donkey and a camel, but those were very rare.
Well, yeah, it's just interesting to see, you know, both, but yeah.
The full meal, those meats, what were the meats?
Right?
Yeah.
The non-vegetarian.
Yes, the non-vegetarian.
Yeah, so we have a few more questions. This one says, did any of the tombs with the articulated stone skeletons, primary burial, have later commingled burials added later?
Oh, that's a question for Megan. I'm trying to remember because all of my sediment samples that were from these kind of sealed contexts. So the question is basically, did we have the fully articulated remains and then on top of them the commingled remains?
Yeah.
If Megan is here, which I don't know if she is.
I think she is. I don't think she can. Yeah.
Although she can't talk. Oh no, Megan.
Maybe
she can type it in the chat.
Yeah, let me see if there's anything in the
Throw it in the questions, Megan. I knew something would come up. Oh, Megan. Yes, she says yes. There were commingled remains on top of articulated burials, but all date before the 2nd century AD.
Okay.
So there you go. So yes, thank you, Megan. I knew there'd be stuff coming up, so I am thrilled you're here. Yeah,
this is great. So yeah, now I will ask another question related to that. So in relation to plants, what would that do to the plants? Like, do you think there are later samples coming in with these later added human remains, or like how would you? Like in terms
of I see, like how we separated the sediment.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, I wasn't in the tomb when we were taking that sediment sample, but from what I gathered was that these were from especially the articulated ones were from sediment that was right near the actual, right surrounding the remains, not on top of it or below it, but right kind of in the same level as the actual articulated burials. Although again, maybe Megan is typing.
Yes.
I should get her to chat. But yes, these were from sealed contexts. So it was the sediment samples. We still actually have to look at the analysis because we had an interesting question that was asked, because this was actually just accepted for Levant, and it will be published very soon, actually.
Congratulations.
It's weird that it comes out all at the same time. It's been a very long COVID-y work in progress that has taken far longer than it should have to get finished, I'm afraid. But these were from whether they were from we had an interesting question whether they were from the head region or the foot region of the burial remains. So we still have a few more things that we will continue to be part of the the process in terms of researching these, as well as the parenchymatous tissue to see kind of what those are from. So yeah, context questions.
More questions. This one is from Jeffrey, so I'll try to pick.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for coming.
So the question that I'm seeing is, I wonder if you could expand upon the pathway of carbonization for the plants. I know you mentioned dung fuel, but I'm wondering how this would have played out. Were they burned prior to deposition or charred after deposition? Maybe throwing dung fuel. It's a lot, so just entertain.
This is one of those $1 million questions. Thanks, Jeffrey. Love that. Where you would love to know actually where that was. And just like when they were saying at the Royal Cemetery of Ur, they don't know how or where these were carbonized. But they were deposited in there. Unfortunately, we don't have the telltale sign of, say, burners outside or fires that would have been right outside that maybe they would have been charred in and then brought in and deposited. I really wish we did. And of course, the more data we get and the more information from maybe more tomb excavations in the region might help clarify some of these issues. Part of me is off on several tangents about those little incense burners, because maybe those were just little fires. They would char the plant material over those and then just put them in. But I don't have any documented evidence for that. This is just me thinking outside the box after reading so much about like incense burners and offerings and how a lot of them were incorporated into tombs in some areas. So I can talk to you more about this later, Jeffrey, but to date, I don't know how these would have been. I would assume that, you know, if there was a funerary banquet going on, perhaps at that banquet during one of the fires, maybe the material would have been charred and then ceremonial placed in those in some cases. So it's a great question.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question from Sarah. It says, what types of evidence would you need to find out more about Nabatean dining activities in or near the tombs?
Hey, Sarah, thank you for coming. She did the amazing ceramics and is wonderful. What kind of evidence? More excavations of tombs and kind of more deliberate focus on where those plants are coming from specifically. See, when we started excavating, I didn't even know there would be plant material coming out of these articulated burials because so little has been published on this. So it was really interesting when we were getting this and I was looking at the data and kind of going, well, this looks like this, you know, so kind of a more focused attempt during an excavation to really document when the or where everything is coming from specifically in the tomb and look for any evidence that ties it all together. And again, comparative material from other sites would be amazing to help us find out more. Incense burners that had residue in it of plants would be great. You know, any kind of fires or hearth features surrounding the area, but I imagine those would have all been cleaned up from banqueting areas because after a banquet you clean up. So much of that would not have been left. So yes, again, great question, Sarah. A more focus, like sitting in there and actually watching during the whole excavation to document a little bit more on my part probably would have been great. But I think I was driving a lot of trucks back and forth during that time. So.
Yeah, I was thinking also art would have helped great, like the way you showed, like the examples from Palmyra and other sites. I was like, it would have been great if similar examples would be found at Petra.
Yes, now you're speaking all the good things that I completely lost because I'm like, of course, textual evidence, artistic representation, anything like that, any kind of data like that would be really beneficial, but we don't seem to have that at Petra. So maybe not yet.
Yes, not yet.
Maybe in the future, not yet, hopefully.
Yes. We have time for one more question. So we'll take one more question quickly.
Okay.
From Allison, do you think the majority of plant and food offerings would have been left at the time of the primary burial, or could they have been left by mourners or visitors during the feasts? Would these offerings have acted as a way of creating solidarity among the living and their deceased relatives?
Allison, thank you so much for coming. This is several great questions here. And I love the way you're thinking about this because it's true. Like, we don't know, but we do know that for the articulated burials, when they were sealed and the context was sealed and the plant remains were incorporated with those, that would have had to been done at the primary burial. However, it's not to say that later things could have been left as well, because I mean, look at today. We leave things at cemeteries all the time. We leave offerings, we still do that. So it's a great question and could actually account for some of the material that kind of is incorporated later that's not actually in with the articulated remains that we find in later levels. So it could have absolutely acted like we do today. Again, I can't get into the minds of the ancient Nabateans, unfortunately, but using modern examples, we do this. You know, I have seen bottles of whiskey left at cemeteries. You know, we leave offerings and of course flowers and things even today. So yes, I think that's completely possible that some of the things could have been at a later date, except for the things that are right with the articulated remains that were in sealed contexts.
Okay, thank you so much, Jennifer. With that, we come to the end of our webinar today. I would like to thank Jennifer for such a lively and exciting presentation. Very interesting material indeed. Thank you all for joining us, wherever you are in the world. Have a nice evening, day, and please stay in touch and register for our next lecture. See you all next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.